Hello and welcome to On Parliamentary Language, and you're joining us in silly season for our first special, this time on UK versus US politics. And I believe, Rob, we're going to be discussing differences and similarities between both UK and US Parliament and the Constitution and things like that. Is that what you think we're doing?
Yeah, essentially the idea is, I know a couple of our listeners want to know more about UK politics if they live in the US and vice versa, really. So I'm hoping that I can give a good overview of both systems and compare them and give case studies that will be sort of like comparable between the two. So you can compare that and then apply that to your own system and understand why that's different. So fingers crossed, it'll work. We'll see how it goes. It could go quite long. Let's see how far we go.
Yeah, sounds good. So shall we first talk about constitutions? Because as a British viewer watching the news coming out of the States, you see the Constitution mentioned a lot, and it's clearly an important document. I know what a constitution is from being in societies at university and stuff. It's like a legally binding document that you run your organization through. But obviously with a country, it's not all the laws, is it? I suppose that's probably the starting point. It's a base on which the laws are founded.
Yeah, it's so the most, like you said, the most iconic constitution is the American one. And it's kind of like a rule book on how to run the country, or at least some of the clear points of how to do that. So the important thing with the American one is that it's codified, which essentially means that it's all written down in one document. All of your rules are there on how you can run your parliament or your government. Sorry. And the next thing is that it's sovereign. So in the UK, Parliament is sovereign, which means you must respect everything that Parliament does. In the US, the Constitution is sovereign, so that sort of means that you must respect everything that's in that written document. You must abide by it all the time. Like I say, all the time, as American listeners will know, you can change the Constitution, but the process to do that is really, really hard and requires quite a lot of public opinion and effort from lawmakers to change that, in comparison to the UK Constitution, which we'll go in, which is slightly different.
So with the UK Constitution, I think it's been mentioned maybe more recently for a few reasons, especially around Brexit and how certain things may be interpreted. But we don't really have a constitution, right? That's how most people see it. We don't have one. So what is the actual state of the UK Constitution in comparison to the US one, where it's all written down?
Well, it's a mess, in short. So in the US, you have the founding fathers, you have a moment, you have a clear point in history where they broke from UK control and said, this is how we're going to run our government from now on. In the UK, we never had that. We were all just sort of tribes coming together and under the rule of one king. And the closest thing we got to any sort of rule saying that we should take a bit more power back was the Magna Carta. So that was back in 1215, and it was essentially an agreement between King John and the barons underneath them, and the barons basically said, we want more power over what we want to do. We don't want to listen to the king all the time. And over the past 800 years or so, we've slowly added new laws together to sort of stitch our constitution together from loads of different bits and bobs. So there's no one document where it's all written down. We just have these sort of treaties or agreements or laws throughout history, which we've used to inform our decision making going forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I suppose probably the thing that's people might ask about is so there have been a few. Magna Carta was a big event where basically as you say, all these nobles got the king basically at sword point and were like, you're going to sign this and it's going to be law. But later on, we've also, we had a civil war and things got interesting then because we had to go get a monarch to come back to reinstitute the old parliament. And what you're saying is none of those things are inherently written down. It's just when each of those events happen, a certain set of rules kind of came into play, which is probably one of the weird things about the UK. We have these very, very old laws that haven't necessarily been repealed, or sometimes if they have been, that it's kind of convention almost.
Yeah. Nobody, that civil war could have been our founding fathers moment. It could have been because it was the one split from royalty we had. But when they took control, they didn't write anything down, or at least they didn't form their own constitution to follow. And even if they did, it would have been scrapped when the king came back. All we've had is some moments through history where slowly the king gave more power. So we've got things like the Bill of Rights in 1699, which was when we had our the Glorious Revolution, which was after King James, who was a Catholic, was driven from his throne, basically by a parliament that was Protestant, and they invited another Protestant king over from Europe to say, "Hey, why don't you rule us?" It was a very British revolution because we sort of said, we don't awfully like our king very much. Would you mind if you came over and took over our country? And this guy in Hanover said, "Oh yes, you know what? I don't mind if I do." And so he came over and he decided to run the show. But when the new king came over, Parliament basically got him to sign a document that said, we will have regular parliaments, elections, and freedom of speech within Parliament. So that was sort of like that was a small power grab from the king to Parliament, but it was just one small step along the road of other things we had. So like the Act of Settlement, which basically established the right of Parliament to determine the line of succession to the throne. So Parliament could say, we want that person to be king next. The Act of Union in 1707, which basically united England and Scotland together, and said that they can share a monarch that had, until then they'd shared a monarch that had two separate parliaments. That put all the power in Parliament in London to take over control. Then we have like Parliament Acts later on in like 1911 and 1949, which kind of takes power again from not only the Queen, but also the House of Lords. And it's a slow drift of power from the king to Parliament and therefore like the people for elections. But it's so spread out through history, and there's no one document that contains all of those documents in one. We sort of grab from little bits from all of them and put them together to make our set of rules for how we govern.
Yeah, so I think a bit of a mess probably sums it up best after all that. So we've talked about this a bit already. Constitutions, we have the US one and the UK one, and how do they relate to law? To what are the laws? Because we obviously have laws that are not in the Constitution, because we have laws written down, right? Lawyers can go and look them up. So how does that kind of tie into constitutions?
So I guess when I'm using the US and the UK as an example, so in the US, the Bill of Rights, for example, gives you the laws of the land that must be obeyed and can't be done. Those 10 rules must sort of be, you must have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to own firearms, etc. And that's the basis of sort of all law in the US to an extent. In the UK, you have different types of law that might not all be related from the Constitution. So the Constitution's built on 5 sources. So you've got statute law, which is passed by Parliament. So basically Parliament tells you what you can and can't do. We've got common law, which again comes from like everywhere from the 1200s up to now. It's just what judges have ruled on that Parliament hasn't explicitly said is good or bad. So if you go to a court of law and argue your case, the judge will look back at all the cases that have gone before and said, yeah, that's kind of what, that's what we've done in the past. That sounds sensible. This is what we'll do now. So those are like the 2 main sources of law. Where it gets tricky with the UK is that we've also got EU law, which was a big sort of one of the points of the referendum, or one of the reasons why people wanted to leave, was because when we joined the European Communities Act in 1972, that said that we would respect some of the European Union's laws above our own. So if you think any time somebody says that a case has been referred to the Court of Human Rights in Europe, that's because even though the UK might say, oh no, we think it's fine by UK law, it may still disagree with EU law. And if the EU rules that to go against the Human Rights Act, they would try and force the British government to change their law to be in line with EU laws. Does that make sense? So that's like sort of a part of the Constitution that's come in from, or we're talking about constitutions and how we're governed, then that's come in from an outside source to affect how we run things.
So I think that's probably an interesting point to touch on, because in the US, they have the states, and then they also have federal laws. So they have state laws and federal laws.
Yeah.
Is that, how does that, trying to think of, like, the UK is roughly the size of a state, right? I know we're weird, but let's roll with it. And then the EU is bigger. So at the moment, it's kind of almost like the EU laws are like our federal laws. Is that a good comparison to draw, or is it very different, actually?
I think it's a good starting point to draw as a comparison, certainly, because, yeah, you're right that the EU law would be seen as like the constitution, the federal law, and the states would have to abide by what the federal law says, essentially. We'll move on to like judges and stuff like that, but where states disobey federal law, the Supreme Court can sort of like rule that a state is not acting in the way that they should be and try and force them to change the laws. That's a fair comparison. I think the only thing which is slightly different, or where the UK might sort of, a lot of people in the UK would disagree with that sort of federal states of Europe idea. With the fact that we've got more laws, and they would say that they're cultural because Britain's laws outdate the EU by so long. Some of them feel they should be sort of like greater than the EU's laws, if you get what I mean. That's like no, I can see that argument. And then there's also, we have the difficulty where we have devolved, because the UK is a country made up of countries. So we have the devolved powers in Scotland and Wales, which are to different extents. And so I mean, there are different laws, right, in Scotland to England. There are some laws that are different because of the devolved powers. Devolved powers are they're probably more comparable to state laws, because there are certain laws that only the UK can have a say over as the whole country, but they let Scotland and Wales have their say over some little things. So I think, for example, Scotland is allowed to control like education policy and some health policy, and a little bit of taxation, but the majority of money raised will come from the rules made in London that affect the whole country. Again, Scotland has no power over the army or national defence. All of those decisions are like protected powers that come from Parliament. So with those devolved powers and those devolved institutions, they do run their own laws, but to a much lesser extent than what the federal, or in our case, like Parliament in London, can set, can do. So
I suppose on that point, again, still kind of tied into this federal state kind of distinction. In America, they have their Parliament, which is Congress and the Senate, that votes on the main laws, but also they must also have an equivalent thing at state level, right? And then we have the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish. Is it Scottish Parliament? I can never get the terms right.
The Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. Yeah.
So, like, are those comparable to kind of similar things they have over in the States, in the States?
I'm not. You know what? I'm not sure. I haven't done that much research into the actual local government at state level. I'm aware of Congress people and senators, and I know that you have like gubernatorial races, like what Arnie won essentially in California. But I'm not sure of how the individual representatives, or how that breaks down within a state's region. That's something I'd really like to know. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you any more information on that.
Oh, that's fair enough. So I suppose it's probably fair to say that state powers in the states are kind of a state government. It's definitely above like what we would consider a local council, right? It's definitely at that kind of, because states are just so big. So
yes. Yeah. On the main, you would imagine that a state like California would have more power over its own decision making, or what affects that state in particular, than Scotland or Wales does, just because it's such a huge area. A lot of the time, if we take it back to the Constitution actually says very little about what rules should be had in each state, beyond that they should respect the laws of the Constitution, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
So they're free to do. The Constitution says very little about, like, it doesn't say how much you should spend on education in each state. That's something that the state could decide. However, the way that the federal government would control it in the US is they might limit funding for something. They might say, hey, do you want money for education? You can have it as long as you follow our plan for education. That's how they keep control over the states. But in large part, yes, the states do have more power to do their own thing compared to the Scottish or Welsh assemblies.
I suppose probably a good example of that is when the gay marriage over in the States was initially, it would come in various states.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could go and be married. I think that's what Ellen DeGeneres did. She went and got married to her wife in California during a period when it was legal. And then you have this kind of interesting domino effect where it slowly builds up. Like it starts off with 1 or 2 states. Once you get over that tipping point of about half the states, then they call in the Supreme Court and they make a decision and they say, well, this should probably be federal law now. And then, the states who haven't yet done it tend to complain, or at least that's the impression we get over here. But then once it's a federal law, everyone has to follow it. So
yes, yeah, precisely, because that's where the Supreme Court has so much power compared to the UK court as well. So because the Supreme Court is ruling on when the case of equal marriage was raised in the United States, I think in Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, it was done on the point that saying that you can't marry somebody of the same gender is against like one of the core rights. I want to get this right, so let me just check. Because the point I'm trying to make is that, so Obergefell versus Hodges challenged the right to equal marriage under the 14th Amendment, which basically says that you should have equal treatment throughout. And it said that to discriminate and say that marriage was only between a man and a woman was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was. And once the Supreme Court has ruled that that you're not allowing people to marry somebody of the same sex is unconstitutional, it becomes a federal law without any law having to pass through Congress, the Senate. The president doesn't need to sign off on it. It's not a public thing. It's just the Supreme Court makes a judgment on how the Constitution interprets. Compare that to how equal marriage was passed in the UK. That went through Parliament. That had to be voted on by our representatives and voted on as a law of the land that said, yes, this is equal marriage and this is how it's going to work. You're allowed to have it in so many places. I don't think you can have it in religious buildings or a certain set of religious buildings that were left out of the law, but it allowed it to pass. So when we're talking about the different powers of the Constitution and the powers of the judiciary in each country, the way that equal rights and equal marriage was handled back in 2015 is a really good case study to see the different methods. Like they both reached the same conclusion, but they went through very different means and different organizations to get to that conclusion.
So you mentioned there that the US Constitution, despite being written down, can be interpreted by the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So despite the fact that it exists and has been written down, and as you say, it's sovereign, people have to follow it, people can still decide what was meant. I mean, I've seen discussions on both sides of this argument, and there's also amendments. So I suppose we should probably touch on all of those points. But so, I mean, a big point that is raised is that when it was written in the 1600s, obviously people couldn't conceive of some of the problems we would have today. Mm-hmm. So following the letter of the law definitely has to be an interpretation, really, because those laws weren't written with. I mean, a big example that comes up is the discussion around the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. Well, I don't know the exact text, but I believe it's the right to bear arms and form an organized militia, or as part of an organized militia. And kind of the point is no one really forms a militia. They just want to have guns in their house. Obviously, coming from a country where we don't really allow anyone to have firearms, I think we probably both fall down on one side of that argument, though we won't get into it here. And that's kind of interesting because, when they said you had the right to bear arms, they were probably basing that on muskets as opposed to, automatic weapons and stuff like that. So how does that process work? We've touched on it a bit. And we don't really have the same thing, do we? Thank you, person in the chat. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So yes, it does imply, at least on my reading of it, that you should be part of a well-regulated militia and not just people with guns. But I'm sure that's where lots of arguments have been over the years.
So the process there to so we've touched on two of them. So I'll start with the one where it's how you interpret the Constitution to sort of change laws or change the interpretation at a federal level, which will then have a big knock-on effect throughout the country. So you've got two things. You've got two approaches that Supreme Court judges can take. You've got judicial activism and judicial restraint. So the activism are people who say that they'll use their own sort of views and values and take into account sort of the social agenda and say, look, here's the Constitution. I know it was written over 200, 300 years ago. How would this best apply to our society today? And when a case is brought to them, so it has to be brought on like by the public, and then it would eventually get to the Supreme Court state. The 9 Supreme Court judges make a ruling on it. Usually, because of the balance of the court, there's about 4 what we would call liberal, sort of like ones that would favour the Democrat side, 4 Republicans, and 1 swing that goes in between. So where you get a 5-4 decision, as was the case in Oberthal versus Hodges, the Equal Rights, Equal Marriage Act, sorry, not an act, the Equal Marriage ruling, it sort of went down those party lines to an effect. So they've used judicial activism there to say, we think that public opinion, and like you mentioned before, that, so many states are doing this seems like the right time to, make this a federal law. Those judges who would act with judicial restraint are the ones who would look at the wording of the Constitution very closely and sort of say, no, I don't think that the writers of the Constitution wanted it to go this far. I don't think they would have wanted it to apply to marriage in this sense. When they made the 14th Amendment, I don't think, which the 14th Amendment was made after the Civil War and was mostly done to secure equal rights between white and black citizens and slaves, essentially. How could that have ever applied to equal marriage down the line? So you've got those 2 competing entities there. But if you use judicial activism, then that's how it gets changed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we've got that way of sort of interpreting the Constitution. Then we've got if you actually want to change the Constitution. So what do you know about that? Do you know how you would go about changing the Constitution at all?
The only thing I know is that you have to make an amendment to the Constitution, which presumably has a voting process behind it, but the mechanics of it, I don't really understand.
Yeah. So if you want to make an amendment to the Constitution, it has to be proposed by a 2/3 vote of each house in Congress. So you need to get 67 votes in the Senate and whatever the equivalent number is in the House of Representatives, or the amendment can be proposed by a national convention called by Congress at the requests of 2/3 of the states. So that gives power either to the representatives of the states or the states themselves. And then once that happens, that has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislature or 3/4 of states. Right. So when you take, so it doesn't sound that much, but when you take into sort of like partisan concerns and how often a Congress or House of Representatives is split down party lines, like even 60-40, which Obama at the height of his powers had 60 senators compared to 40 senators. That's how he was able to get like a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate to pass Obamacare. It's almost impossible to make a constitutional amendment without there being cross-party support, without both parties doing it, without for there to be a lot of support in all of the states as well. So it is possible, but it's just really, really hard, and everybody needs to be really, really certain that they want to do it. So the amendment process is like the really hard way of changing laws. The Supreme Court way is arguably the easier one because it comes down to the interpretation of the already existing laws that you don't have to change.
And so when was the most recent one of these amendments? If they're so hard to put through, they presumably, so I know there's 27 of them. I've looked that much up. So there's 27 of them. So one would estimate probably one every 10 or so years. Does that work out as? No, America's older than that. Maybe one every 15 years, roughly. But yeah, so when was the most recent one? Because if it's so difficult, especially with partisan politics, especially at the moment with politics being very partisan.
Oh, I think
it's in the chat. Apparently it's 1992.
Oh yeah, 1992. Yeah. So, and I think the 27th Amendment is just on something rather benign, like it prohibits any law that increases or decreases the salary of members of Congress from taking effect until the start of the next set of terms of office for the representative. And as chat's reminded us as well, the first 10, the Bill of Rights, were all passed at once, right at the same stage that the Constitution was written.
Right. Okay. So I think that's an important thing I wasn't aware of, because because the right to bear arms is an amendment.
Yes.
And I always took it to be like they decided this a bit later on, so it wasn't really in the original document. And I appreciate that's all what all amendments are technically, but the fact that it all happened at the start, I feel is, well, with the Bill of Rights is interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And of the 27, let me just get this right. The 18th Amendment was prohibition, so that enforced prohibition. And then I believe the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. So two of those amendments balance each other out, essentially.
Right. So 25 actual in place, essentially.
Yes, which is bizarre when you think when you compare something like, we'll take gun control, because that's the one that comes up most and will probably be like most applicable for sort of UK and US listeners. So you have high school shootings in America, and a lot of people say we want to have more gun control in place. They can't, because the debate is essentially so polarized along party lines that it would be nearly impossible to get an amendment through Congress to repeal the Second Amendment. Compare that to the UK, where after we had the school shooting in Dunblane, Scotland, after that, within months or even within weeks, Parliament had come together as a group, had put some legislation together to ban the sale of firearms or the gun that was used in the attack, and put that on the books. And that was done within weeks. Because it wasn't an amendment, it wasn't in our constitution, it was just a law that hadn't been covered yet, and we were able to make the law to ban them. And it was as easy as that. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a similar thing in Australia, right, where they had, I think it was at the time, the worst mass shooting in history. And then, within a few months, they'd put through a law to ban the sale of firearms. And ever since, the number of mass shootings has unsurprisingly dropped much to a very low level in Australia, because it's hard to get hold of them.
Yeah, but that's not to say that just because you've got a codified constitution like you've got in America, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember that it also enshrines the right to free speech.
Oh yeah,
which is something that the UK government theoretically could also pass within weeks to repeal. It just hasn't been done yet. So to have certain rights enshrined and make it very difficult to change, or to have some things like, I don't know what people think of Trump or what he would do, but if you've got somebody who you might think is, not the most reliable leader of your country, they are very restricted by what they can do by the bounds of the Constitution. It acts as a safety net. It acts as a check and a balance on everybody's power to make sure that those divine rights that were written down in the Constitution those 200 years ago are still in place and are damn hard to change. If Britain was to vote somebody in who, well, I guess the real case study here would be Nazi Germany and Hitler, who was able to get himself into a place of power within Germany, had a lot of power to just rip that constitution up and make all his own laws. Then he just made everything he wanted legal and everything he didn't illegal, without thinking about people's civil rights or having certain rights enshrined. So there certainly is, like, you've got that benefit to the written down constitution of the USA compared to the sort of hard and fast, let's make it up and go along rules of the UK.
So we've mentioned, I suppose we've probably covered this as much as we were planning to here. So we have the difference between the two constitutions and how they work, and we've delved into law a bit. We've mentioned a lot of terms that we're just kind of taking as read, our readers have at least come across. So, and we talked about power. So maybe now's the time to talk about the various houses of parliament in both countries. What is a Congress, for example? Maybe I could give a brief overview of the UK, because I'm more au fait with that, and then you can correct me on anything, and then you can delve into the US side of things.
Yes, please.
So as I understand it, we have two in the UK. We have the Houses of Parliament covers both the Commons and the Lords. So the House of Commons are the people you vote for every 5 years normally in a general election, and the leader of the ruling party, i.e. the party with the most votes, becomes the Prime Minister. So we don't have the equivalent thing in the States where you vote for a president as well as for seats as separate, I believe. Whereas over here, you're directly via a first past the post system. Whichever party has the most MPs will have their leader become the prime minister. So you have to bear that in mind when you're voting for your local MP, but people are voting on both local and a national issue at the same time. And then once they're in power, that they pass the laws, the House of Commons will have readings of a law, which I know we've mentioned in previous episodes, and then eventually they'll have a vote on the law, and if the vote passes, it then goes up to the House of Lords. And the House of Lords gets really interesting and proper. This is the properly archaic thing we have in the UK. So I'm going to open this up just so that on Wikipedia, just so that I can get the terms right here. So it was reformed in the early 2000s. So we have a mixture of hereditary peers. It used to always be hereditary peers, pretty much. So those are people who had the title Lord given to them initially by the monarch, and their children, normally their male children by the right of primogeniture, would inherit the peerage. They would be called Lord. Anyone they're married to would become Lady by definition, I believe, and that carried on. Now that's been limited to 90. So there are only 90 hereditary peers in the House in the House of Lords. And then the other peerages are lifetime peerages. So, for example, a person most people have heard of, Andrew Lloyd Webber, who famous for all those musicals like Cats and The Phantom of the Opera, is a lifetime lord. It was given to him by a previous government, and the current government, I believe, has the entire say over who gets to go in.
Yes, pretty much. I think they have to get it confirmed by the Queen, but the Queen doesn't really say no. Yeah.
As is often the case, the Queen rubber stamps things, but she's never really used her power to say no, and would probably lose her power if she did so. So you have the hereditary peers, you have the lords. So this is where the terminology gets great. So we have the peerage is made up of the lords spiritual and the lords temporal. So the lords temporal are all the normal everyday lords, but the lords spiritual are 26 bishops of the Church of England, who are just also lords. Nowadays, as I say, the majority of the lords are life peers who are appointed on the advice of Prime Minister. And then the lords is an upper house. They're all unelected. They're chosen. The lifetime lords are chosen by Parliament, as I said, but they're all unelected. And obviously the distribution of the chamber can be quite different to the distribution of the lower chamber. There's currently 793 lords, and of that, obviously 26 are the bishops. And then you have nearly 249 are Conservative. We have 188 from the Labour Party. We have 186 who are described as crossbenchers, and I think you can probably give me more information on that. But as I understand it, the crossbenchers basically are lords who have not declared an affiliation to a party at all, so they're essentially swing votes. And then Lib Dems have 98, and then all the others are much smaller. So there is a kind of split. I don't know if it's intentionally drawn this way on Wikipedia, where they have the Conservatives and the bishops on one side and Lib Dems and Labour on the other, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of how the voting falls. And they basically they're allowed to send punt laws back down to the House of Commons if they go, oh, well, this is wrong or whatever. So there is a check and balance going on. But obviously each current government will try and load the lords in their favour by putting through as many lords as possible while they're in government. And that's probably where the problem lies when you compare it to maybe the US system. But then the US system has its own foibles. So is that a good enough summary, do you think?
Yeah,
is there anything I got wrong? Yeah.
No, nothing wrong. Great summary.
This is something I've actually read up on because I went on a proper Wikipedia. I started reading up on Earl Grey of all things, and then found out that Earl Grey was named after Prime Minister Earl Grey. And then I got into the House of Lords, and I read basically every Wikipedia page on this at some point about a year ago.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of people will have heard of the more controversial appointments to the Lords. So, like Lord Vader, Lord Voldemort. All of these people, I'm not quite sure who gave them that status, but they ended up there anyway.
But I suppose the important point before we compare it to the US system is that these are unelected peers. That they have been put there through various methods, but the public have never voted on who gets to go in there. Well, I suppose a very rich member of the public may be able to convince the Prime Minister to make them a lord or a lady, but yeah, that's different. So how does that compare to the US? My assumption is, and I've written this down in the notes, is Congress equivalent to Commons and Senate equivalent to Lords, or is that not how it works?
Not quite. So Congress is the equivalent to the Houses of Parliament.
Right.
So Congress means the whole thing. And then you have the House of Representatives, which is probably the equivalent to Parliament because it's the lower chamber. And then the Senate is the Lords.
Right. So we don't tend to hear the term the House of Representatives in the UK that often. We tend to just hear people talk about Congress because it's the general term.
The whole thing. The important thing, so unlike in the UK where we have just sort of like one elected chamber and one unelected, the House of Representatives and the Senate are both elected chambers. They have different election cycles, which means that they're slightly different in their makeup and how they vote on things. So in the House of Representatives, there's 435 members, and essentially they represent the population of the states. So each state will have a certain amount of representatives assigned to it, and that's based on how many people are in there. So, for example, California will have way more than Alaska.
Is that entirely proportional, or is it roughly proportional?
It's roughly as proportional as you can get it, essentially. A bit like our own system in the UK, where we have constituencies, and some of those constituencies will have more people than others. It's probably a little different between the states, but as proportional it can be. The members of the House are elected every 2 years, which makes them sort of very susceptible to public opinion. So if you want to know how the public feels about the two parties, the House of Representatives is where you would look. That's the one that changes the most often. Are you aware of like midterm elections and the midterms that are coming up this year?
Yeah, I'm aware that those are coming up this year, and that's because it happens to just fall halfway through a presidential term, right? And presidential terms are fixed, so barring any... Oh no, I mean, even if a president dies, right, the vice president would become president, so the term would still be fixed. It's not like with us where the parliament picks when the election is going to be, as long as it's within the 5-year term. Yeah.
So they have like fixed elections every 2 years. Senators, so you've got the Senate, which is composed of 100 members, and that's 2 members per state. So whereas the House of Representatives is meant to like represent the population's opinion, the Senate kind of represents each state's opinion, because Alaska will have the same amount of senators as California. And they are elected, well, they have a 6-year term, but a third of them are elected every 2 years on a rolling basis. So in the midterms, a third of the senators will have their seats up for grabs, which means that the Senate's seen as the upper house because they're there for longer. They're meant to, because they stick around for 6 years and can maybe outlast, at least go through one president's term and a little bit into the other. They're meant to have like a longer view, and they tend to, well, the idea is that they would protect state rights more because they would be, because they're there to represent the state. It's more valuable for them, particularly like an Alaskan senator, that they really keep their seat and represent their state.
I was going to say, so the reason the midterms are important is because presumably when you have a load being voted in at the same time as a president, that swell of public opinion that elects president is probably indicative of what will also pick. It's probably also indicative of how the votes will go in Congress, right? And then the idea is that after 2 years, the next vote is kind of testing the water, really. How are things going? Yeah,
it's a check on... The US is all set up around checks and balances and making sure nobody has too much power. The midterm election is sort of a check on that power. So because you've got these 2 separate chambers, what usually happens in midterms is that the party of the president will lose at least one of these chambers. So because they're all voted on individually, I would say it's likely, I think 538, which is usually where I go for my predictions on how elections are going to go, I think has predicted that there's about an 80% chance that the Democrats will take the House in these midterms.
Right.
So that will mean the Democrats will have control of the House. The Republicans may still have control of the Senate, but the Republicans are definitely going to have control of the White House with the Prime Minister, with the President there. You can compare that to the UK, where the Prime Minister is always going to have control in the House of Commons because they're just the leader of the largest party in the Commons, which means they have way more power to get legislation passed. In the US, it's harder if you've got this sort of divided government to make both houses agree to stuff to make sure that legislation gets through. So those are the type of differences between the chambers, how they're elected, how laws go through, because we touched on it a bit with the UK. Laws tend to go through at the same time through both chambers. So they go through the House and the Senate, and then they agree on the stage and they agree what the rules are for debate. The House may agree on a version of a bill that it likes, and then the Senate may agree on a version of the bill they like. And then they have to come together with both bills and knock the differences out and make sure that they've got exactly the same bill, that exactly that same bill passes through both. Then it goes to the desk of the president, who says, yes, I approve this bill, or he can go, no, thank you very much, veto the bill. And the veto means that bill's not going to become law unless you have 2/3 in each chamber basically saying, no, we disagree with the president, this should go through.
Right, yeah. So there's still another check and balance there, that the president can't just veto everything.
Yes, basically. But again, it's super hard to get that 2/3 majority sometimes, particularly if the Senate or the House or either one of those is very partisan and voting on party lines, then it's nearly impossible to overturn that veto. So yeah, those are the main differences between them. We've touched on it a bit already, that it tends to work in the UK. It's easier to pass laws than in the Lords, because you mentioned that the Lords can bump stuff down to the Commons. The Lords can't do that with any bill that involves money. Anything about taxes, the Lords is not allowed to get involved in, because essentially in 1911 there was a Liberal government that said, we want to start taxing the rich more, and the Lords, which was full of rich people, unsurprisingly said, no, thank you very much. And the Commons came back and said, you better pass this or we'll get rid of you entirely. So a law was passed that made sure that the Lords couldn't interfere with any money bills. Also, when the Lords pushes stuff down to the House of Commons, they can do that a maximum of 3 times of rejecting it before it gets a free pass through. So one of the more famous examples was the fox hunting ban under Tony Blair. He sent that to the Lords 3 times. 3 times they rejected it, but on the 3rd rejection, the Commons didn't need the approval of the Lords for it to become law.
So just a technicality point there. When it goes back to the Lords, so it comes back to the Commons has to look at their comments essentially. Is there then another vote at that point? So is it essentially you're saying the Commons has voted in favour 3 times, and so therefore we overrule the Lords? Is that how that works?
It doesn't have to vote each. It has to vote if Parliament decides to make any changes to the amendments, or sometimes it votes on the amendments individually.
Right.
But essentially, Parliament can look at everything the Lords has said and go, "Nah, we don't agree with any of this. We'll send it back again in the form we sent it to you. Reconsider your response."
So yeah, essentially they could just say, "No, we're certain this is what the people want. We're going to put it through 3 times," and the Lords have to go, "Fine then." Which when they're not elected, makes sense. I'm sure we can add to the list of deep dives for next year's silly season that will go into the ideas of Lords reform, but we won't cover that anymore here.
But you compare that to the House and the Senate, where both of those have to vote on absolutely everything, and every rejection means a lot. It means that the UK Parliament passes way more bills than Congress does. But the bills Congress usually passes are have loads of scrutiny and a lot more consideration than anything that passes in the UK, probably because it has to have that support. And Congress is the most productive when you have a united government. So, for example, the last 2 years, you've had a Republican House, Senate, and President. That should be the perfect time to get all of your big policies through. Obama had it in 2008, 2010. That's how he was able to pass the American Health Care Act, essentially, the Affordable Care Act, because he was united in all 3 of those chambers. And when there was a backlash against that in the 2010 midterms, and he lost the House, then that made it a lot more difficult for him to get anything else like that onto the agenda. So you often see in those first 2 years, presidents rushing to push through their biggest policies before time runs out.
Without wanting to derail the discussion too much, what is your opinion of Trump's ability to do that? Because I know it's been a big discussion. Like there was a whole thing about the first 100 days and stuff like this. Has he been successful in getting through as many things as Obama did in that time, or has he kind of squandered that opportunity?
He's, in short, I believe he squandered it because there's a couple of reasons why. The biggest and best example would be his failure to repeal or change the American Care Act, which is what he wanted to do. One of his big promises was we were going to get rid of Obamacare. It's too expensive. Blah blah blah. We're going to enforce new laws that get this through. The whole thing was a bit of a shambles from start to finish in terms of the state of the bill and how it went through some of the processes, some of the committees. The bill that passed in the House of Representatives was going to be incredibly different to the bill that might have passed in the Senate. And in the Senate, he had a very small majority. I think it was 52 to 48 when he went to vote on it. And it only took some dissent from 3 members of the Senate, but they were 3 who were obviously annoyed with Trump. Trump hadn't been able to get them united behind the party. They were upset enough with Trump to kill that bill before it could go any further. And that's probably the last chance he'll have unless he regains control at the midterms. But I feel, like I mentioned, I feel that's unlikely. He's also really struggled with immigration reform. You've had the Dreamers Act, which we've talked about previously, and how he's threatened a federal shutdown, which is essentially like won't approve a budget or they won't get a budget through the House because the parties can't agree on how to pass immigration reform. And the only reason they can't agree is because the parties are so polarized on the issue. There's no way that he could unite Congress behind that one issue and get the bill passed. The one thing he's been successful at is taxes and the reform of the tax system in the United States, because that's a good old-fashioned Republican ideal that all Republicans agree in, that you should have lower taxes. So that passed with little problem. But that's about the only big congressional legislation that's gone through that he can really hang his hat on and say, yes, I've done a good job here. Everything else controversial, like the travel ban order and stuff like that, that's come from executive orders that Congress can't even deal with anyway. That's something that he said himself. So
I suppose that's maybe the final point here. I mean, we could possibly touch on how voting works, but we're going to do a special on voting later this summer. So the president has, or seemingly has, a lot more power than the prime minister does. Is that true? Does that hold? Is that, or would you say in the UK that the prime minister is actually quite powerful?
The prime minister, when the prime minister has a very strong majority in the Commons, is far more powerful than the president, in my opinion. Because the reason for that is when they've got a big majority, they've always got support in the House of Commons to pass what legislation they want all the time. The opposition can't really do much to stop it. They're not going to veto their own laws. The House of Lords is very limited in what it can do to stop it. The Queen's not going to say no.
Yeah.
Okay. So the prime minister's super powerful in that sense. The president might be faced with something where he's got one of the 2 houses that aren't controlled by his party working against him. He's got checks and balances on his power, how much he can, do in the office. For passing legislation, the president is super weak compared to the prime minister. Where I think people think that the president has more power is on the global stage. And it's because America is such a powerful country as well, that when you have the president is the head of state, he represents the United States abroad. Everything he says has an impact on, what's going to happen around the world. It appears that they have a lot of power when in reality, passing any legislation that can change things at home is really, really difficult.
I suppose that's another thing to touch on. Head of state. The prime minister isn't the head of state in the UK, is she?
No, it's the Queen. The Queen is the head of state.
And she is the longest serving head of state in the world because the Queen just keeps on going.
Yes, I feel I should stand up and start singing the national anthem, but I shan't. Sorry.
The Queen being the head of state makes things a bit different, as you say. Like the Queen, as we saw earlier in the year, is the person who welcomes people on state visits, and I suppose we've also discussed the soft power of that a little bit as well. Like there have been times where the Queen has been able to invite someone who the Prime Minister might not have wanted to invite or been able to invite easily from a political point of view, but the Queen can invite them because the Queen is not politically minded officially speaking. So for example, we had Mugabe come, I believe, on a state visit, and the idea being that we could maybe show him stuff, show him the UK and be like, oh, maybe you should do things a bit more like this, please. Less of the murder.
Not quite sure how well that works, but yeah, at least we gave it a shot.
That's the idea, right?
Yeah. Precisely. Having a head of state that's not political has its benefits. Certainly, in the fact that everything the Queen says or doesn't say doesn't sort of like she's a good figure. She's a good neutral figurehead for the world, and knowing that she'll always be there is a level of stability. I feel. I mean, that might be too noble a way to put it. But with the president, it's far more fixed. Of course, the president can only be president for 2 terms, 8 years. Our prime minister could be prime minister for as long as they wanted, as long as they have support. Thatcher, Blair both nearly went over 20 years in power. I think if you said to anybody that, you could have 20 years of Trump, that might be something that's a bit scary.
Yeah. We talked about executive orders earlier. Does our prime minister essentially have anything that's the same? I know we don't have the equivalent thing with the signing ceremony and showing it off to all the cameras. But am I right in thinking that at least via the cabinet, the prime minister can do certain things without the approval of the House of Commons? For example, is it not true that all treaties go through the prime minister and the cabinet?
Yeah, I believe they do. The prime minister will have something called prerogative powers, which are essentially powers that the Queen used to have, but they've been given to the prime minister. So they're things like award honours, sign treaties, grant legal pardons, take action to maintain order in case of emergency, grant and withdraw passports. And the other one is declare war and authorise the use of the armed forces, which is something that declaring war is a good power to compare between the UK and the US, because it's a good example of how things have been written down, but they've been twisted. So in the UK, Theresa May would have power to go to war whenever she so chooses. But what's become convention in Parliament is that we now vote on wars. So ever since the Iraq War, it's become convention in the UK that even though the Prime Minister knows they have the right, they go to the people or they go to Parliament to confirm military action. If you compare that to the US, in the Constitution, it says that only Congress has the right to declare war. The President is is the Commander-in-Chief of the military forces, but Congress declares war. But the last time Congress declared war officially, I think, was World War II. So if you think of Vietnam, Iraq, none of those were wars confirmed by Congress. All that happened was the president authorized force in those conflicts, and then Congress confirmed the use of that force at a later date, but not in a war capacity. So that's one where the rules for the UK are one thing, but we actually do it through the Parliament. And in the US, even though it should be done through Congress, actually the president in reality has had the power to enact it. So it's weird how you can bend and twist these rules to your own ability. And some might argue that the president being able to do that, he needs to do that where somebody could launch a tactical nuclear strike. Is it right that he should go to Congress and say, we should probably have a vote before we send any missiles, guys? It's not practical. He should have the power, but that's not what's written down in the Constitution. Everybody seems to have ignored it for the time being.
And I mean, it's interesting kind of the precedent that gets set. As you say, that's essentially the precedent that's been set since World War II, where everyone's okay with it. Whereas we have the opposite thing where everyone was okay with it. And then we went to the war in Iraq, and public opinion was so against that at least afterward, maybe not at the time. But afterward, public opinion was so against that it's essentially led to a precedent being set where we have to have a vote on it, because at least then when you're running for re-election, you can be like, well, we had a vote on it. It's not my fault, is it? Would be the argument, I assume.
But it's still just a precedent. It's not written down anywhere. Despite it happening every war since the Iraq War for the UK, it's still not written down. So the next Prime Minister could choose to ignore that if they wanted. But would probably be looked at very unfavourably by public opinion if you decided to go to war without a vote.
It would be political suicide, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on?
We've touched a bit on elections as well. We've talked about the difference between there being staggered elections in the US and the way that in the UK, in the way the UK, we have sort of one fixed election for both MPs and the Prime Minister rolled into one. We just vote on the MPs, and then our Prime Minister is selected from that group of MPs. Whoever makes the largest party in the country is selected. We've talked about both using the first past the post system as well, which is a system that means that it's winner takes all. If you get 51 to 49, I'm sorry, the person with 49 gets no representation whatsoever. The person with 51 gets that person in Parliament. That tends to lead to another similarity between the two countries, that we have mostly a two-party system because it favours a winner-takes-all. You've got the Republicans and the Democrats in the US and Labour and the Conservatives in the UK. You've got that big split.
So that's actually something I wanted to ask about, because I know it's kind of generally joked about in the US that you can throw your vote away on a third-party candidate. But that's not so true in the UK. While it may be true at a national level, we still have a number of Liberal Democrat MPs, and we have had the coalition government in recent memory. So is there a reason America's more partisan in that way? Is it just because they've always had essentially two big parties? Because they initially had one party, right? Which was the get rid of the UK. This is our country party, essentially. And then they had splits. Anyone who's listened to the musical Hamilton will be aware of the various starting points of that. And again, I've gone on a proper Wikipedia deep dive about this at one point, because I was confused about why, the flip-flopping between the Democrats and the Republicans and the other parties that existed. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, as someone's mentioned in the chat, we had the Whigs, but the Conservative Party is probably the longest running single party we've had in the UK. But because of political splits and things, so we had Labour split off into the Lib Dems at one point, and then you had New Labour come back and they won. But since then we have had two parties in government with the coalition. So is that any reflection of the systems, or is it just like a historical accident, really, that we have tended to have more third party representation?
So I think this is sort of my personal opinion here before I say that it's a sort of an established theory, but it's very hard for a third party candidate to become president because the way the system is set up. So they get voted in through the electoral college. We could go into a little bit if you want to. Do you know much about the electoral college?
I know a little. So I think the main reason I've heard anything about it in recently, and I heard about it the last time around, it gets mentioned whenever there's an election. But the main reason I suppose it's been mentioned this time is that technically Hillary Clinton had the majority of the votes, but she didn't have the majority of the electoral seats. So my understanding, and feel free to correct me on this, is that every state has a certain number of votes that go to who is president. And in the past, you would have, still technically today, but in the past, you voted for your state representative who then went and you trusted that they would go put the votes for you in the correct box. Now, technically, that still applies. So one of those representatives can choose not to vote the way the people have told him to, but convention is that they always do. Because I know there was discussion about that when Trump came in, whether one or two representatives would choose to vote against, and that could ruin it for him. But essentially, yeah, people vote. That informs the representatives as to what they should do, and then they have an amount of vote based on how big the state is, and that goes towards picking the president. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, that's roughly correct. The only point to add there would be that the way that they decide college votes each states have, it's the number of representatives they have from the House of Representatives and the number of senators.
Right. So it's 2 plus whatever that other number is, which is proportional-ish.
Yeah. So proportional-ish, but you're right saying very ish, because again, it's a winner-takes-all system in each state for those votes. So you may get, I think there are 2 states, can't remember the names of them, but there are 2 states where the electoral college votes are split proportionally. So if one person got 60%, the other got 40, they'd get 60% of the electoral college votes from that state, and then 40 from the other. And then, but in places like, if we take Florida as the big example, as the one that won Bush the election back in 2000, all of the electoral college votes from Florida went to Bush, which pushed him over just, even though the popular vote was far in favor. Not far in favor, but was in favor of Al Gore. So that winner takes all system makes it's hard for there's hardly any space for 2 candidates almost, or you've only got the choice of 2. Having a third in there is near impossible. And I think not being able to vote in a third party president makes it hard for people then to say, well, who would support that third party president's views in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, both of which are also voted through on first past the post systems, which favour those winner takes all. There have been third parties in the past in the US, but they tend to have been very short-lived, or once they failed, people have abandoned them. So I think Teddy Roosevelt set up his own party when he wasn't selected to run again as president, and he took like a couple of states in the South, but didn't do much. You've also got Ross Perot, who ran against Bill Clinton and Daddy Bush, Bush Sr. There was at the time they thought there might be a chance that he would take quite a few votes, and I think he took maybe over 20% of the popular vote, or near enough that. But still, it was so far behind the two parties that once he'd failed to become president, it just faded away. So because you lack that, so in the US, because you lack that ability to become president, and you would lack then the support in the legislative chambers, it makes it really hard to vote for a third candidate and think that they will win.
In the chat, it's been pointed out there are the Green and Libertarian parties that do exist in the States. So there are longer term third parties, but they don't get many votes or any. Yeah.
I don't think they have any Congress people at all. Like out of all the senators and out of all the representatives, they don't have a single person there. When you compare that to how the UK system works, it's probably easier for third parties to pick up the odd constituency. It's far smaller than the US, but it's easier there. It's also easier in the UK because there's more distinct sort of regional national parties. So take the SNP, for example. In 2015, they won all but one seat in Scotland, which made them, which put them up to 54, which I think officially at that time made them the third biggest party in Parliament. It's way easier in our system to vote on regional lines and then have clear power in the Commons, because that's where you can vote against the Prime Minister. So that's another reason. And the final reason, like you said, sort of history, the fact that we had the Conservatives and the Liberals were traditionally the two parties, then Labour grew up as a third choice, and then Labour outgrew in popularity from the Liberals, but the Liberals have always been there and have a historical connection and have been able to fight on different lines. We've got more of a history of third party success, which makes people more likely to vote for them. And the barrier with first past the post, even though it's very not proportional, it's at least easier in the UK to pick up one or two seats in comparison to the US.
I suppose maybe the final point then before we close for the evening is one thing when you're trying to look across. I think most people have an understanding that the Republican Party is a more conservative party, and the Democratic Party is a more liberal party, and then in the UK we have so that. That's the thing you just have to know in America. There's nothing necessarily in the names. Whereas in the UK, we have the Conservative Party, who are the most conservative of the core parties. And then you have Labour, that is the more liberal one. And then you have the Liberal Democrats, which actually probably fall slightly right of Labour, despite the fact they have Liberal in their name. That's probably a good thing to explain. And also, one thing that I've seen that is quite amusing is when you're discussing politics with people from the US and you share maps. Because the colours are swapped, because the Democrats are blue and the Republicans are red, whereas we have Labour as red and Conservatives as blue. So things can look very different if that you're not expecting that. So red is blue and blue is red. Just remember that.
Cool. Okay, I've made that note.
Yeah. So is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I just think that, we've touched on a lot of strengths and weaknesses of each other's systems. It's important to know that, it's a real proof that no system's perfect. There's a lot from the US, personally, as someone living in the UK, I would like to steal. So I would absolutely love a written constitution to protect rights in our country, to act as that safety net, to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion enshrined in a law that was super, super hard to change would be brilliant, I think. But also I'm just a little wary of who would be our founding fathers. If we were to do it now, would you want Theresa May and Boris Johnson to be the people who...
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Would be my personal opinion.
It becomes too political, and the question mark about who does that is super involved. And then you also look at, the UK system, you think, it's good that we can react quickly and pass legislation super quickly with it. That has its benefits as well. But yeah, there's a lot of plus and negatives, and the whole point of this is to say that our system's better than your system, or vice versa. It's just, I always find it really interesting to compare how two different systems have done it. I think the US almost, you could say, is born out of a UK system anyway, because we were around from, we've mentioned that the start of our constitution started in 1215. Theirs is just like a fork in the road, around the 1700s, where they went, right, no, we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to run it. I find that super interesting.
Excellent. So, thank you once again, Rob, for joining me. Thanks to all our listeners who have come along and listened in the chat. For people who are interested in coming along and listening to us record on Discord, there will be a link in the show notes. And you can just come along and listen as we record. It's interesting to see people's opinions and people responding to us in the chat. Also very helpful if we forget something, as has happened several times this evening. So yes, that's great. As always, you can find us on Twitter at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Facebook at Unparliamentary Language. You can find us at parliamentary.observer, and you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And yes, so it's a good night from me.
And it's a good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Rob slowly gets further away from the microphone.
Bye.
Yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed our first silly season episode where we've gone into kind of a deep dive on a topic. We will be coming back in 2 weeks' time with our next episode, which is on post-war Britain, foreign policy, and all that kind of stuff, from post-war Britain to now. So that should be an interesting topic. I hope we can keep that down to like an hour. So we'll see how that goes. Yes, that's our next episode. So good night. / I always get this one wrong.
Oh, have we changed? We've changed it to / we always get this one wrong.
No. Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, where we'll be every time I get it wrong. First time every time I try and think of too many things.